Thank you also to Rachel for organizing my trip, and to Rachel and Ellen from Videotage for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be back in Hong Kong. I was here the last time quite a few years ago at the Microwave Festival, and it was great to see the Videotage location and the artwork by Perry Bard and Matt Soar. Demoscopy. And I would urge everybody to also go and take a look at it. I think it's on for about 2 weeks at the other location, and it's also really nice to be here at the Good Lab on a Sunday morning. So thanks to all of you for taking that opportunity to get up early in the morning and come in for a talk, which is going to be, as was briefly announced, on open sourcing in U-Nation. It's a bit of a, I suppose, maybe complicated thing, and it's also something which is very, very, very much at the beginning. And just before we sort of like dive into it, the talk that I'm giving today is basically the first time that I've publicly had the opportunity to really sort of present or discuss the project after having been in South Sudan for our first conference on open source in South Sudan, which was just in December. So the material is still sort of work in progress because we have tons and tons of documentation. I'm going to try to give some background and some context to it. But first, I wanted to start with something maybe related but also completely different. I mean, for those of you who were here yesterday and were at Bob Ree's keynote, he was talking about critical making and the Critical Maker Lab in Toronto that he's a part of. And I mentioned that I had just received this first critical making zine. So this little booklet, handmade booklet about critical making, so about the whole broad spectrum of critical making, was made by Garnet Hertz. Garnet Hertz is an artist and robotics scientist from Canada, and he's working and living right now in California at the UC Berkeley. And this zine is directly related actually to the lab that Bob is in and the work that he and Matt are doing. And this magically arrived on my desk in Berlin from California in the morning before I left to come to Hong Kong. And I haven't been able to open it up yet. So I thought, just as a kind of like a connector to yesterday, because what I'm going to be talking about today is also sort of about critical making, but again in a completely different context. So I thought I'd just take this opportunity to open this up, and I'll pass it around to everybody. You can take a look at it while we get into this talk. Juggle a little bit. Because of the time difference, it could very well be that Garnet is actually watching this in California. It's like yesterday, right now for him it's yesterday evening. So Garnet, if you're there, your booklet has now made it to Hong Kong, and I'm opening it up right now, live for you here at Wikitopia. This is a premiere. So I hope there were no spelling mistakes in it and that kind of thing. Of course, if they were, they would be our fault. So the booklet is, or the booklets, there's about, I think he made 300 of these, and there was an open international call for people basically around the world to submit already finished documents. So he basically collected handmade documents to make the zine, and then he made like 10 chapters out of it, which he then photocopied himself by hand, bound and cut and everything by hand. It's a little bit of a masochistic thing. So there's one here on projects. There's one here on conversations. There's one here on places. I'm gonna hang on to that one for a second. There's one here on science. So just, pass them around. This is like the first time I've seen these as well, so you get to see it more than I do. There's one even on critical making childhood. So, it's getting interesting. This, of course, is a no-brainer. History, critical making history. Oh, there's an envelope. Okay, no idea what this one is about. Well, whoever gets the envelope can take a look at it and tell me later what's in there. Oh, this is an important one. Critical making terms. So what it is that we're talking about, I guess, when we talk about critical making. Yeah, this is a good one too. Manifestos. This is also super, super important when you talk about critical making. Yes?
So Bookleteer, which is a project by a group called Proboscis, allows you to make these sorts of booklets open source using PDF about this size, slightly smaller. You don't have to do very much cutting up if you use their little format.
Yeah, I think Garnet had some sort of strange sort of physical necessity to actually get into the dirty work of actually cutting them. Oh, this one's introduction. So I guess I should have started with that one, but that's the way these live things go. So I'm assuming that the reason that he sent me this, and maybe Bob hasn't even seen it yet, is because apparently he put in a piece here about OS Juba, so about open sourcing a new country, which is kind of bizarre because I wouldn't have necessarily thought of that in the usual critical making context, but maybe it's not in here. So I'll just take a quick look. I'm assuming that if it's in here, it would be in places, but it may be somewhere else. So here it is. So the talk that I'm doing today for the sort of the first public time is already kind of published in this handmade zine. So that's really kind of nice. So Garnet, if you're there, thank you very much. And Bob, thank you for this great talk yesterday about all this kind of work. And if anybody wants to get a copy, one of the few copies of this bundle, you can get in touch with Garnet here. That's his website. It gives a lot of explanation about the rest of the work that he does around critical making, and his contact information is also there. But for today, partly because of the discussion yesterday and the things that we were talking with a number of the people here, I felt it was necessary to give a little bit of background and context, like diving straight into the scenario of open source and the new state of South Sudan sometimes comes as a bit of a strange sort of thing. Like, what is a guy who's coming from an architecture background, who's been involved with media arts and politics for a number of years doing in South Sudan. So I wanted to actually start with a project that is also running right now as part of the work that I do, but has a much longer history and actually is sort of the diving board for going to South Sudan. And the thing is that South Sudan, of course, is in Africa. It's near the equator. It's just north of Kenya, south of Sudan. And this work with a group called the Arctic Perspective Initiative is taking place in the far, far north of Canada. So it's Arctic, hardcore Arctic Inuit culture. And it's an organization and a project and a group that I've been working with for about maybe 10 years and a bit more. It's also an open source project, and the slide says it's a transdisciplinary quest for the fusion of data and traditional knowledge through the development of open and free sensor and land knowledge systems. So again, I suppose in reference to yesterday and some of the things that we were discussing about appropriate technologies, I love this photograph of the Inuit elder using the binoculars and being able to manage his pipe at the same time. So there's a lot in this picture which relates to the kind of work that I do, and that relates, I think, to a lot of the kinds of work that people who are dealing with so-called appropriate technologies and open technologies and so on, and let's say cultural transformation are dealing with. And this particular project of the Arctic Perspective Initiative is located right now in the north of Canada, but it deals really with the whole circumpolar area. So it's on a trajectory now to set up kind of a circumpolar cultures and technology initiative, basically to look at how all the various circumpolar cultures deal with the issues of modernity, of nomadism, and how technology can and does help them create a sense of place and being able to stay basically where they live. And just to give an idea of what we're talking about, so this is a view of the globe from the North Pole. So the North Pole is like about here. Canada's over there. Russia, Europe is kind of down here. Hong Kong is off the map that way. And the specific area that we're working in is around here. And this O here is roughly where the geomagnetic pole is right now, which is quite a ways away from the actual North Pole itself. And the interesting thing about that is that it also means that, for example, in this whole area around here, compasses, for example, don't really work because the relationship to north doesn't work the same way. And GPS technology, for example, it's kind of there now, but the satellite coverage hasn't been so prevalent until very recently. So this specific work of the Arctic Perspective Initiative and the work that I'm doing with the communities there is about mobility and survival. And one of the things which fascinated me about Arctic civilization, Arctic culture, is the way they use technology. They're much, much more media savvy than we are as people, because they know exactly why certain kinds of technologies are the way they are and what they can be used for. And they are used for survival, a great part. If I forget my mobile phone at home, it's not a big deal. If I lose my mobile phone up there, it could mean the difference between life and death. It's also about scenarios of what we call insulation and isolation. So insulating culture, making it feel at home, and isolation, not in a negative sense, but in the sense of let's say isolating things and people and being, in order to let them kind of like expand and grow in a protected or in a protective environment. This is also something which is very important in the north, and these kinds of technologies, this type of hood for the babies. I mean, this is still the way to carry kids around. I mean, you would never take a kid in a baby Björn around in that area, but you stick them in your hood, and kids are fine. There's also a lot of issues, political issues about empowerment, cultural empowerment in the north. With the melting of the ice, there's a new race for resources and for sovereignty in the north. It's a big issue for Canada. It's a big issue for Russia. Famously, a Russian boat went and planted a Russian flag on the ocean floor of the North Pole a few years ago. We're not quite sure if this was just done in a swimming pool somewhere or whether it was really done there. But this notion that countries and powers are staking out land where there's actually no land is kind of interesting. So part of the political spin of the project is, as it says here, to help empower the Northern Arctic peoples through open source technologies and applied education and training. But it's also for us to learn from and to work with. So we're interested in the way these people and these cultures use, adapt, and develop technologies in order to strengthen their own cultural identity, and also to strengthen their own sense of sovereignty over their land. So a number of the projects that have been developed that are actually happening right now are, I've just got a couple of quick little examples here. There's one of them is a mapping project with a UAV. So what you see now kind of as so-called drones. I mean, these things have been around for a long time. They're easy to build, but now they've become quite military tools and toys. So there's been a project with this UAV, very simple, comes in a little case. Here's the ramp that it shoots off from, to create maps, because there's accurate mapping of the Arctic and of Arctic communities is still something which hasn't really been a big priority of the Canadian government, or actually of other governments. There's satellite imagery and so on, and there's some maps. Some of the maps from the north still are from the early 70s, so first sort of satellite passes over the area, and there's still huge black spotches around. So this is a collage that was made by the UAV that you just saw on the previous slide of the village of Igloolik. It's an island. Here you see the beach. Of course, this is in summertime. It's warm in the summer. There's no snow. There usually isn't, so it's not just a climate change thing, but it can be like 20 degrees there in the summer. It's quite nice. Very rocky. Nothing really grows there except moss and lichen. But this is one of the first real images and maps of Igloolik. And this is a project which is done in collaboration between artists, technologists, scientists, social researchers. So it's not a government program. In fact, there's very, very little money for this kind of work. This is really kind of activist stuff that's taking place in the context of art practices. So these are artists who are also interested in the artistic and cultural value of this kind of work, this kind of imaging, and so on. But it has a manifestation in a real social political environment process. And so these little squares on this larger map of the Canadian North indicate where proper geodetic survey maps exist. And they're mostly centered around places that actually have communities. But the other areas around it, they're either not or very limitedly mapped. And one of the things about the project is also that through the mapping, they're creating databases where they're exploring the histories of the locations. They're putting in the Inuktitut names, so most of the maps have English or French names. And so part of the, let's say, the work in establishing the Inuit identity in the north, part of the work of empowerment and also sovereignty is about making maps in the language that the people actually speak. There's a part of the project is an idea of creating a fab lab up there. This is still just a vague idea, but there's a lot of interest in doing that. And one of the other projects that I wanted to mention, because again it relates quite a bit to the topic in general, and it relates maybe to some of the things that we will be doing later in South Sudan, is this thing called the Sununi. So there's a whole range of projects from hydroponics to sensor technologies within this Arctic Perspective Initiative. And the Sununi is a little box. It's an open hardware, an open source box. It costs about 250 Canadian dollars to put together. And it's used for environmental monitoring. So environmental monitoring of the weather, of the climate, of sunlight and cloud cover, flora and fauna. It also picks up sounds. So it delivers a huge range of data. And the objects themselves, that's what they look like, kind of like sort of like they're in like a Peli case it's about this big. There's mobile ones like this one, and then there's more fixed ones for fixed nodes. The idea is to strew these along the coastlines and the hunting routes where the residents there are. On the one hand, to improve the information about climate and about hunting. So in Inuit culture, there are only hunters. So when you meet an Inuit who is maybe a lawyer or a filmmaker or a dentist, they will usually say, well, I'm a hunter and a dentist. I'm a hunter and a lawyer. I'm a hunter and the mayor of Igloolik. Because again, if you're not a hunter, then you don't really have much to do there. And the thing is that hunting is also a life necessity which is under threat. And it's under threat from a lot of different directions. It's also under threat to a certain extent from the government. And the government, the Canadian government in this case, also has sensors basically set up by the military to chart, let's say, shipping in the north, especially as the ice melts. This is a big issue. And that government data is then used to make arguments for certain forms of development, whether economic or military or other forms of development, often against the will of the local against the will of the local communities. And with this Sununi mesh sensor network, the communities are starting to collect their own data and comparing it to the government data that they get. And in fact, their data tends to be a little bit more accurate because they have more sensors out in the field. There's a closer relationship to the data collection and also to the interpretation of the data. And this is the way the data kind of looks. But then, of course, there's different ways to visualize it and to interpret it. So that when the government comes and says, well, we can send ships through here, and the local residents say, well, you can't really because of this, that, and the other thing. Oh, thanks. I've got actually a cup here already. Yeah, I've got a bit of a cough today. They can show their own data. So again, this is an important issue. It's an open data issue. If you can't get it from the government, you make it yourself. Again, I think this is one of the core ideas behind critical making. And the first test area of the Sununu mesh network, so it's it is being implemented, is along this little piece of coastline, and these these yellow dots are the places where these sensors have been set up, and this is starting to kind of move around the Arctic. But okay, we stop there. I wasn't here just specifically to talk about the Arctic, but I think this kind of work is really essential, and I'm particularly interested in the role that artists and cultural activists, hacktivists, and so on play in real social and political processes. So, I mean, there is a whole, of course, there's a tradition of, artistic activism and so on. And I'm not particularly interested in saying, okay, art should have a political application, or especially media art, but at the same time, there are artists who do have work which is really interesting to then look at in those kinds of political terms. And when the kinds of methodologies that artists use come into a process of technology or technological development or empowerment, cultural development, then sometimes there's interesting and other types of developments happening that we might not have thought about before if we would be, let's say, using traditional means or relying on government agencies to do this. So, moving from, the Arctic to South Sudan, people ask, well, what's the relationship between that kind of work and South Sudan? Of course, it's a different context, it's a different climate, but a lot of the issues are the same in the sense that the role that this kind of work with art, technology, open technologies, and open source can play in defining cultural process, in creating strengthened awareness of independence, of creating identity. These are these are issues that are all across the board in South Sudan, and it's for me it's something that started a little while ago. There's been war in Sudan for decades, basically before, but also after the British left in the 50s. The generally Muslim North against the generally Christian South. I mean, that's a very vague difference. There's more precise and specific things. But these two gentlemen, one of which is an accused war criminal being sought after by the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, and another gentleman who's a bushfighter. They actually got it together to create a deal which ended in the secession of the South and the independence for South Sudan. And all of a sudden, there's this scenario that a society that basically has spent all its present adult lifetime in fighting is now faced with the task of creating a country. So it's not just that, okay, we know how this kind of thing works. We know how a democratic process works, but there are no institutions for any of that stuff in South Sudan. I mean, Sudan was governed, well, the large Sudan was governed by Khartoum, and there was some autonomy in the south, and together with some colleagues in Berlin, we had this idea, well, wouldn't it be interesting to take a look at the role that today's open source communities can play in actually building this new state? So we're not looking at right away some of the really important issues that also include things like poverty reduction, hunger, no education. These are all in there, and these are all things which are interesting to look at through the lens of open source. But we wanted to look at things in a bit more broad context first. What is the role that open source and open technologies, open data, and so on can play in post-conflict development in general? So open source is not really something which is considered in a lot of development work and development politics. And a lot of us don't really understand why. It's kind of a no-brainer. But the world has also changed incredibly between, let's say, 5 years ago and today. And South Sudan is perhaps the first new state that has the ability, if it takes that choice, to use open source methodologies and technologies to help define what this state is about, and to create an open society. And we started with this question of Juba. Juba is the capital of South Sudan. And could this become the first open source city? And we weren't really thinking directly in the sense of any old kind of city, but really a capital city. And a capital city is a different kind of thing than a regular urban center, because it has, of course, a very important administrative, political, but also symbolic function that's relevant and relative to the whole state. So if we can look at the issue of open sourcing the capital, then perhaps we can use that as a framework to inform or to, let's say, open source the function and the development of the country as a whole. And this was really just an idea. And we had a little conference around this in Berlin back in June last year, kind of like an open brainstormer. It was meant to just have a few people from the local tech, culture, open source community from Berlin coming together to think about what open source can mean in this thing. But the more we started to talk about it, the bigger the group became of the people who really wanted to discuss this thing. So at the end of the day, we kind of had like a serious conference happening with, whoops, we're slipping into Juba history? Okay. Some of these slides may be a little bit mixed up, but a guy came from Indonesia. This guy up there in the corner, he's Venza. Some of you might know him, and maybe he's even been here to Hong Kong to Videotage. He's the founder and director of an organization called HONF, which is the House of Natural Fiber, which is an open cultures and technology foundation, lab, doing incredible cross-disciplinary work in open technologies in Indonesia. The guy sort of diagonally across from him is Daudi Vera. He's one of the directors of an open source company in Nairobi called Ushahidi. I'll get to that in a moment. This lady here, Maya Bott, she's an economic director at the KfW, which is Germany's development bank. So she's kind of like the World Bank kind of person of Germany. She came to this event because she's done reports on crowdsourcing, but she was interested also in this idea of a broader open source strategy for this new state. And this gentleman here, he's the representative of the SPLA, which is the Sudanese People's Liberation Army in Germany. So before South Sudan became independent, he was kind of like the quasi-South Sudanese ambassador to Germany for the liberation movement. And he came from Frankfurt to Berlin, and it's like, oh, okay, well, that's cool. So this stuff started to get really, really serious very, very quickly. We went very fast from just kind of like a conceptual idea to really the real stuff. And Juba, just to give a little bit of perspective on it, it kind of looked like this a couple years ago. It looked like even less built 5 to 10 years ago. It's basically kind of a dusty crossroads, small regional capital. Here there's sort of a little map of South Sudan. You see it's landlocked country with Sudan, Congo, or Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia all around it. So it's a tough neighborhood to start a new country. And the premise that those two gentlemen had that I showed earlier for making this country is that the oil of Sudan is in the south, and the pipelines and the infrastructure to get the oil out is in the north. So the north provides that infrastructure, and the south provides the resource. So that idea is supposed to kind of sort of help cement independence. Of course, a few days after independence, the South Sudan government thought, well, maybe we'll build a new pipeline going maybe through Kenya or Ethiopia or something. And that, of course, the Sudanese did not like that too much. And we were just, discussing this issue of getting the oil out through other channels. So this has kind of destroyed the first year of independence, actually, of South Sudan. It's a bad scene right now. There's a lot of pessimism. But at the same time, there are people who really want to make this kind of experiment work. This is just a few little pictures of Juba today. Most of Juba is built either of small tukul huts. This is sort of like a typical residential unit. There's little villas for people like us to live in. There's a lot of containers around. Most of the buildings in Juba are built using shipping containers. So either ones that are already kind of set up as offices and things, or real shipping containers. So this house here, which is actually a restaurant, is a bunch of these shipping containers stacked together and then cladded in bamboo. So it's really kind of like fast stuff. Most of the streets are not paved. This is actually, these pictures are all kind of like in downtown Juba. I'm sorry the resolution is not so great, but just to give a kind of a snapshot. It sits on the Nile, nice cafes and restaurants along the Nile, and there's a lot of now new construction, a lot of construction coming from China, happening in Juba, so a lot of frames of multi-story concrete buildings. But even there's a little bit of a hesitation to build the city because the government also said right after independence, well, they're going to maybe make a whole new capital. So they want to build a new city somewhere completely different where no city has existed before. So maybe there's more of a chance to look at the actual function of open source in the building of a new city, but I think that's not going to be happening. So we started to talk again more about the context of the country as an open source kind of scenario, and just some of the facts, facts, again, it's not quite clear because census is still a tricky thing in South Sudan, but it's a relatively large country, large in area, small in population, so about 8 million people. It's estimated it's actually about 10 million people. It's not that huge in terms of population. It's a lot of rural territory. Half the population is under the age of 18. 3/4 of the population is under 30. That's probably for us the most interesting statistic. So it's definitely the born digital generation. A huge percentage is rural. And 27% of the adult population is literate. Now, when they say 27%, let's say a quarter of the population is literate, adult population, my guess, and most of the guesses of other people, is that it's not quite 50-50 between men and women. So we're interested also to know more about what the literacy rate is among adult women out of that small percentage. But nonetheless, a lot of euphoria still today. And in terms of this capital city, its biggest challenge really is its incredibly fast growth. Juba was the fastest growing city in the world between 2009 and 2011. It went from around 250,000 inhabitants at the time of the peace agreement in 2006 to over 1.3 million today. So in just a few years, 1 million people kind of came into this little dusty capital. So kind of how to deal with that. And so the normal, or let's say the traditional ways of looking at open source urbanism, which has a lot to do with mobile technologies and sensor technologies and efficient traffic systems and mobility through the city. This is none of this applies here. We have a much different scenario, and as I mentioned earlier, we're not so much interested right away at this actual physical structure. No, sometimes people ask, well, what does an open source city look like? And I would say it doesn't necessarily look like anything else. It has to do with how it's built and the kind of participation and the kind of political interaction between the population and its citizens goes into actually building the city. So the open source model that's adapted to urbanism is one of the participatory element of open source. And there's, for example, 3 straightforward, I guess, rules or kind of, not constraints, but basically guidelines that you can use for that. So one of them is this requirement of open input by all stakeholders in affected cities, including outsiders with innovative ideas. That's an important issue of how to deal with insiders and outsiders. The requirement of participatory government and decision making for the final outcome, and the requirement for the accumulated knowledge to be put into a commons for future use and remixing in other projects. So if you look at this in an urban development sense, in a country that has 10 state capitals that all have to go through this process of development, and authorities who don't really know, because there's no real planning organizations and no real planning happening within the government. We're trying to look at how to adapt these kinds of simple rules into a structure with which that kind of development could begin. At the same time, we're looking at open source models in the sense of the kind of space that they create for exchange and collaboration. So there's a huge need and desire for, let's say, simple access to technology. I mean, there's very, very little infrastructure in South Sudan, but there is infrastructure. There's quite a good mobile telephone network, but there hasn't really been that connection about how that telephone network can be used in order to create economic development or better education or access to knowledge and information. So we're interested in these elements of the open source model, which also have to do with that whole element of course, collaboration, which is inherent to it, the element of sustainability, and of course, the notion of accountability and transparency that you can get if you have, for example, open data structures. And there's in Africa, there's a huge movement or movements for open technologies labs. The iHubs is one of them. The ICE hubs, the ICE hubs, including one in Addis, one in Cairo, and other places. They're let's say places like this, but actually packed with people, and they are serving a growing and very important role in society because they provide a space and an alternative and a place for access to technology which doesn't exist often in the schools and the universities and in other kind of public places. And in South Sudan, even in Juba, in the capital, the students at the university, and yes, there is a university there, with architecture and engineering department, computer science department, medicine, there isn't a single wireless network on campus. So as far as I'm concerned, that's almost kind of like a war crime. And well, the country's been independent for over a year, and it's had, for over 5 years, billions of dollars of aid money flowing into it, and not a single organization has been able yet to put in a wireless network in the university, and that's a crime. So we're, with the work that we're doing also with our partners in the South Sudan diaspora and people in South Sudan, we're trying to make these uncomfortable truths more visible as well. And we start talking also about hacking and hacking systems. Was mentioned yesterday, not the hacking of stealing, but really the hacking of so-called playful cleverness, as Richard M. Stallman. So this put it, like the sense that if you've got something broken or you break something open, you take it apart and you put it back together in a different way. This is an important issue in South Sudan because part of the issue there, or what is being told in the media and so on, is that there is nothing there. You talk to people, they say, there's no technology, there's no resources. But it's not true. This stuff is there. It's not necessarily sitting there in the same way that it might be sitting on a store shelf in Germany, something, but there's incredible resources, even on the campus of the university, with which to do lots of stuff. Okay, so now we came back to the stuff here with these people who are involved in the whole process. I'll just very quickly go through a couple of these examples because they're, I think, interesting in this whole context to South Sudan. There's the gentleman that was just up there in the previous slide, there beside the lady from the KFW. This guy here, Johnny West. He's a journalist who started a project called Open Oil. And Open Oil is about opening the oil industry. And what is meant by that is to get access, public access to the oil contracts. This sounds kind of wonky in a certain kind of way, but in the countries that rely entirely on oil income for the income of the country, Libya is a good example, Iraq is a good example, South Sudan is a prime example. Rarely does anybody know what's actually in the contracts for the oil, the major income producer of the people. These are not private contracts. These are contracts which belong to the people, belong to the state. And even within government, there's often little known about the oil contracts. There's maybe a small group of people, we call it deep government, who control these oil contracts, like 2 or 3 people who know what the contents of these things are. So you have a situation, for example, in South Sudan where the finance minister isn't getting the data from the oil contracts which are being signed by the government, and he has to rely on somebody kind of in between saying, well, this is how much is in there, so these are the numbers that you have to work with, but he doesn't actually see the document. So it kind of opens up this scenario that, well, maybe an oil contract is for $4 billion, and the finance minister is told, well, there's $2 billion in there. So he plans with $2 billion, and then you ask, well, sort of what happens to the other $2 billion. So Open Oil makes these studies of these various countries, and through various forms of pressure, governmental pressure, outside pressure, internal pressure, tries to get the facts on what goes on. And they produce these oil almanacs, so not just South Sudan, and they get industry professionals together to look at how oil contracts work and how to read and understand them. I had mentioned Venza and Dowdy earlier. Ushahidi is this platform. It's one of the world's leading open source companies for crowdsourcing. So Ushahidi, not just, but let's say primarily makes certain kinds of maps, so crowdsourced maps. It started off by a group of people who made a map of the violence that was taking place around the country in the wake of the elections in Kenya in 2007, and has since become a very easy, user-friendly platform for all different kinds of mappings that rely on the input of people out in the field, on the street. It's been used in the Haiti earthquake and post-disaster relief. It's used there was a project in Serbia that sort of mapped out sort of who's got guns in the towns. It's used by kids to figure out where the best hamburgers in town are. So it's got a huge array of uses. And it's one of a group of companies and initiatives that is also African-born. So there is an understanding within the way also commercial and business structures work in Africa as to how open source can also be effective as a business model, because Ushahidi does also make money. And a lot of this is basically based on just data, getting access to simple information and how people use it and how to filter out the stuff that is no good. Eric Hirschman, who's one of the Ushahidi co-founders, he's done a number of studies on, let's say, the relationships also of internet penetration in Africa, mobile stats. We won't get into that in extreme detail, but one of the things I think is quite interesting is that in this diagram here of Africa, these are the main telecommunications trunk lines. It's the only continent that actually has a comprehensive telecommunications trunk line as completely encircling it. I mean, it has to do with the fact that maybe it's sort of an island kind of thing, but even Australia only has like one or two kind of lines coming to it. And there's still enormous potential to be tapped from this basic infrastructure that's there. HONF, this organization in Indonesia that I had mentioned, is an organization which I think is a strong example of the broad range of work, the cross-disciplinary kind of work that happens when architects as well, but artists, scientists, researchers, farmers, biologists get together and think about ways in which to look at systems which, let's say, everyday people, so people in the community, people in the city, people in the farms, can use to solve problems that they have that are not getting solved in, let's say, some of the more abstract ways that maybe governments understand. So we've got a group of artists here from this House of Natural Fiber. Don't ask me why it's called the House of Natural Fiber. It doesn't really have anything to do with fibers per se, maybe fiber optics or something, but it is the Yogyakarta Open Media and Fab Lab. And two projects here, some of which some of you might have seen or have known about. This one with the image up there and this little petri dish here is called Intelligent Bacteria. It's a project which I was really happy to host at Transmediale in 2011. In fact, it won the Transmediale Award that year. It's a project which is basically it's a sound installation, I suppose. It's a sound installation made of the fermentation of different kinds of fruits and the different kinds of gases that these fruits emit in the fermentation process are then picked up by sensors and translated into different forms of audio, which then create a kind of like a self-manifesting orchestra. So the installation itself was then called the Bacteria Orchestra. Like you kind of play the fruit. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful object, and it makes beautiful sounds and makes beautiful smells as well. And then you can drink it at the end as well. So when you take the installation down, you don't just put the stuff back in the boxes, but you have a party, and that's kind of nice. But the other side of the project is that it's a biotech project. It's done in a way that people can come to the lab and learn about fermentation process, about different kinds of bacteria, how they work, and then it's used as an outreach project in the community to teach people how to ferment and distill alcohol without killing themselves. So this is an issue in a Muslim country like Indonesia, where it is legal to drink, and there is beer and wine and alcohol, but there are certain taboos around it. So a lot of people are making their own booze, and they don't do it right. They get sick and they die, or it does happen. So this presents the making of alcohol also in a kind of a playful an artistic way, in a way that people can kind of relate to, and might make them want to actually make their own kind of intelligent bacteria wines and stuff. Very beautiful. Well, don't go away. Beautiful project. What happened here? Okay. Another project that they're working on right now is called micronations, or democratizing energy. So it's a little bit more complex than the Intelligent Bacteria project. It deals, on the one hand, so this is a sketch of the test area for micronations. It's also a kind of a distilling project, except that it's about looking at the waste product of certain kinds of rice that are farmed in Indonesia and how they can be better used for energy. So again, it's not really a new thing. The waste products of plants and other biological plant resources are used and have been used to make biofuels and alternative energies. But it's not necessarily a practice which is done either in an efficient way or in a low-scale way on small and subsistence farms. So they're developing technologies in the way in which different kinds of growth systems work together. So again, something which is not necessarily new, but it's the way that these things are put together. Rice paddies, with irrigation, with fish in them, so certain kinds of fish that then the waste from the fish nourishes the rice. The rice is ready, you can harvest the rice, make a paella with the fish that are in there, you harvest the fish, and the husks from the rice are then used in a fuel recapture system. The flip side of the project is that it's looking at the issue of both fuel and food sustenance and sustainability in Indonesia, both of which are huge issues. And there is an issue in Indonesia about looking at creating food self-sustainability by a certain time, in around 20 years. And what HONF is doing is they're looking at data which is being collected from, again, different kinds of satellites and different kinds of sources in order to create the kinds of visualizations and data that farmers can actually use to then make these fuel and food farms more sustainable. So again, there's sort of like a big loop of technology and practice going on there, and there's an installation for that as well that kind of looks like this with the different monitors with the data on it. It's right now in a pilot phase, but it's something which is now being tested on a larger scale, also with the government starting to look at it. And they actually they're doing a pilot also in East Timor around it. Oh yeah, again here the bacteria orchestra. Yeah. This guy, Nikolai Georgiev, he's part of an organization called Open Source Ecology. I know we're almost out of time. I'm getting to the end. Open Source Ecology is an international open source project. It's, described here as a network of farmers, engineers, and supporters building this thing called the Global Village Construction Set. Basically what open source ecology is doing is that they're building machines, not just, but primarily farm machines, that can be sourced and built pretty much anywhere. So they develop kind of like a mechano set blueprint, let's say for a tractor, that is based on simple parts, so parts that can be built kind of anywhere, and parts that then can be then serviced, repaired, and reproduced anywhere. So you could take the plans for, let's say, this tractor and build one or 100 somewhere in the States. You can take the same plans and build the same tractor, but maybe with completely different materials in India or even in South Sudan. One of the interesting things about a project like that, or the idea behind that, is that it creates a whole range of also spin-off economies. So the number of trades and skills that come together to make these things are included in the whole process of manufacturing, of distribution, of design, also of repair and maintenance. So it's an alternative idea to, let's say, just buying 100 tractors from Germany or China or wherever, getting them to wherever it is they're supposed to go, and then when they break down, either flying the technician in from Germany or China to maybe check the battery, or other kinds of problems and issues that happen around it, and entirely as an open source kind of project. So this global village construction set that they're working on, they've already built 62 prototypes of these various kinds of machines in 4 different countries. They're being tested, they're being used. Certain things like batteries, but they become, of course, issues. I mean, there are serious technological challenges to this kind of thing. But again, these are things where, if you look at it in its own component sense, there are solutions to them in pretty much every single place on the globe. Just these solutions are different, being done different ways. Even in South Sudan, there is the possibility to source, let's say, batteries for these kinds of machines and and tools. Yes, I mentioned Dura, the gentleman from the SPLA, and the lady from the Tactical Tech Collection. This idea of creating an open source strategy. This is where we are right now. We're looking at practices. We're looking at context. We're talking to a lot of people, trying to learn what the country is about, and we have some interesting and very helpful supporters, because this is a kind of project that it's not the usual kind of development kind of thing. It requires vision also from South Sudanese. Without their desire to do this kind of thing and to really create a new identity for this new country, it wouldn't work. So one of the people that we work quite closely together with is the first female ambassador of South Sudan, Satona. She's fortunately the South Sudanese ambassador in Berlin, so it's great to have somebody like her, who basically has spent her whole life on trying to empower women in this state of constant conflict. So this has been her life task of giving so-called, what she says, of course, voice to the voiceless. And of course, a lot of this work is about giving a voice to the voiceless. So it is how to go from a conflict society to a peace society. And in the work that we're doing with her, it's also how open data, open systems, open education resources, access to quality education can actually help and play a role in that kind of work. We just had this conference, as I mentioned, in Juba in December. It was the first time that we as a group were there, and we were able to talk about open source with members of the South Sudanese government, with civil society players, with the university, with a whole bunch of different people. And we've now started to work on actually developing a pilot for this idea. And the pilot is being done together with this lady here, Nyandeng Malik Dilic. She's the governor of one of the states of South Sudan. So South Sudan has 10 different states. And again, like Ambassador Satona, she's a woman. She's the first and only female governor in South Sudan. So again, for her, she's also on a powerful symbolic mission where she sees the opportunity to establish power structures that are civil structures, civic structures within open source. And her state is a very rural, agriculture-based state. And she recently said in an interview just a couple of weeks ago that the effects of climate change on agriculture, saying its impact on agriculture and natural systems put a burden on achieving sustainable development. Straightforward, it is an issue. And according to her, the linkages between climate change and many dimensions of equitable development and growth present both a crisis that must be tackled and an opportunity that must be seized. And this relationship between crisis and opportunity, this is exactly the space in which this idea of critical making and open source in a kind of new state construct like South Sudan works. So it was amazing to hear her say this kind of thing, because normally you only hear people talk about the crisis and the impossibility to solve it, and not having the vision to say, let's look at that and look at it as a real opportunity for change. So this event that we had in Juba was called Media and Makers. It was done together with an organization called MICT. It's their Media in Cooperation and Transition. They're an organization which has worked for a long time in Sudan and South Sudan on training journalists, independent journalists, and also helping create economic platforms in which independent journalism can work. They also work primarily in crisis and post-crisis areas, so they have projects also in Iraq and Libya, Tunisia, basically in most places where structures for the protection of journalists don't really exist. And we set up a wiki as part of the whole documentation of this project, which we're now using to basically set up this roadmap for open systems, an open systems roadmap for South Sudan. So if anybody wants to check out this wiki, it's this here. It's basically the notes from that meeting. Like any wiki, if you want to put your own comments, interests, and idea into it, you're more than welcome to it. Some of the people who were at the conference coming from outside were some of the leading African open source, open government, open data people, developers. Dorothy K. Gordon, for example, she's the head of the Free Software and Open Source Foundation for Africa, FOSFA. She calls herself a liberation technologist, an amazing woman. And one of the other projects of the many that we're looking at, but we've already started to test in South Sudan, is a platform, a collaborative knowledge base called Sauti ya Wakulima. I think I'm ending on this one. It's called The Voice of the Farmers. It's an open source platform and software that was developed by a Mexican researcher called Eugenio Tiselli. And he originally developed this program or this platform with this piece of software called Kovats, which he developed. It's an open source app for Android. It's a very, very simple app that relies simply on image, audio, and video that is uploaded directly to a wiki-style platform on the internet, and it's used in a project with farmers in Tanzania who are basically making observations on the way climate change over the seasons is affecting their crops. And they use these mobile phones with this Kovats application to make interviews with each other, to make photographs, so on. And then they get together once a week, discuss this material. The material is collected in a knowledge base to look at this, the scenarios, situations that are going on in other, I've got some images of that, in some of the other communities, to develop then common strategies of how to address the issues of crop damage or the way diseases are coming in or changing according to, let's say, the visible and acute problems of climate change. Now, the interesting thing about this is there's a lot of these kinds of projects going on, like SMS project, messaging projects to create dialogue, let's say, between citizens and the government and so on. But this is a project which I like because even if you're illiterate, you can use it. It's not text-based, and everybody speaks, and everybody loves to take pictures and make videos, so the farmers have actually really gotten into this thing. And Tanzania has a very good system of so-called extension workers, extension nodes. So these are like kind of like farming community centers that are scattered around the country, and there's one person, at least one person in each one of these extension services centers who is then trained in how to use the system. It's very simple. It takes about 5 minutes to figure it out. And this person acts as the moderator between the farmers and the other communities, and basically make sure the data is running and so on. So the thing is that the project now, of course, it was started as a research project. It had some funding, but is now working independently. So this idea of knowledge transfer has actually kind of happened in this context. It's also a very big issue. It's like, is there really knowledge transfer for development organizations? Do they want to kind of like keep their foot in the door all the time? Or can you really give the power to use the technology to the people who actually need to use it and want to use it and can use it? In this case, it's actually working. It's spread to a whole bunch of other counties in Tanzania. And it has a map in there. It's a very simple interface. You can call up these videos and clips and so on. Each clip has a small statement from the person in it. And right now we're doing a little test of this in Juba. So I've come to the end. Thank you very much for your patience. As I said, we're really at the very, very beginning of I think what is an exciting and complex trajectory. I'd be very, very happy to have input, whatever form, exchange of ideas with any of you on this. It is an open project. This is sort of how you can get in touch with me if you want to. It's my email address, my Twitter feed. This is the website, so that's my agency site. Still really kind of a lousy website, a simple WordPress thing that we threw up quite quickly, but you'll get the material there for it. So everybody here, thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion for the rest of the day, and I guess we can also have some questions, feedback, and commentary now. And I do need the little booklets back. Yeah, back there. I think you need to get a microphone. Is there a microphone for the gentleman? No, but I think for the streaming, you need it.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Yeah, that's. I think you selected a number of really fascinating examples of what can be done in the field, and I hope the slides will be accessible somewhere on the net. I would like to play the devil's advocate.
Yes, please do.
We are talking about critical making.
Yeah.
Good. If we try to understand where are the roots of critical making, I mean, what critical making is covering, that means DIY, escape the consumerist society, and so on. Actually, the roots are in Africa. I mean, everywhere in the world, maybe in South America, maybe in Asia. Wherever you go in Africa, you see people doing that all the time. They solve the problem by finding tricks, by modifying technologies, by using defects and limits of things, and going beyond the limits. So, if I play the devil's advocate, don't you think some people could think we are trying to put words in what is a very daily practice of this part of the world?
actually, you're not playing the devil's advocate, because that is actually what the whole thing is about. I don't know, were you here yesterday?
Sorry, I was not there yesterday.
No, because
So,
we mentioned
mistake.
we mentioned this this thing that Africa is maker culture already. So what you're describing and the way the markets work, the way economies work. I mean, the necessity to make things by hand using recycled materials, pieces, whatever, is maybe not even just tradition, but in a lot of places just economic necessity. So it's part of the survival structure, and it's part of economic development and so on. And this is one of the reasons, one of the main reasons why we had this idea to link up open source methodologies to that kind of maker culture. So how to, let's say, scale and adapt and use those kinds of real and existent cultural vocabularies to create the kinds of development issues that the South Sudan state is facing. So on the one hand, there's a more straightforward software-based and economic technological thing that the ministries perhaps should be using, open source platform, when they're setting up their ICT structures and all that kind of thing. I mean, there's that kind of aspect of it going on. But the whole other aspect of it, which is related to some of the projects that we're doing or showing here, and the kind of, let's say, vision that these people like the governor of Warrap State have, is exactly about that. She has no idea about open source. She's maybe heard the term before, and she hasn't heard of the Open Government Partnership and open data, but she sees and understands what that can be in terms of dealing with the kinds of challenges that she faces in developing and structuring her state. So basically, we're sitting down together and we're looking at these kinds of scenarios and saying, look, if you've got that particular type of issue or problem, maybe there's this kind of solution, that can be used for that. One simple example is she was talking about the lack of desire, now that there's peace, amongst young people in her state to engage in agriculture, or at least to engage in agriculture the way they did, like for their parents and grandparents' generations. It's really getting their hands dirty. And of course, these subsistence farmers in some of the most poorest areas of South Sudan, also in Warrap State, who are herding cattle and doing subsistence farming, some of them have like 2 or 3 mobile phones. Like, it's really weird in that sense. So for sure, there's something there where we can take those kinds of contexts and synergies and put those young people who know how to deal with the mobile phones, but they're kind of like sitting there kind of waiting for the cows to go by. They don't want to have anything to do with them. I don't know exactly what that is yet, but there are things that have been done in that kind of context. So let's look at the way that technology can support, perhaps, and you look at farming and agriculture, because farming and agriculture is not going to go away from Warrap State. Oil might be the backbone of South Sudan as a state, as a country, but cattle herding, cattle farming is the backbone of the economy in Warrap State. So often it's exploring what these possibilities are, and to get the sense that there are choices that are to be made also about technology and about owning, let's say, your information, your data, your methodologies, and using them for those kinds of contexts. So it's in the sense that what I experienced in the north of Canada, where there's maybe a different understanding about technology than we have about it. I've had similar conversations with people in South Sudan. And at first, of course, you have to explain, what open source is, And maybe that whole concept is not even important to people. It's more about how to use technologies and collaborative methodologies and ways to make things happen. And in fact, when we had our conference there, a lot of people kind of misheard the term. We were saying open source, but they were hearing outsourcing. And they got really, afraid of what these guys are talking about outsourcing. It's like, shit, that's exactly what we don't want to have happening here. There's too much of that. Outsourcing of data even and that kind of stuff. No, we want to have the data in South Sudan. We want you to take ownership of the data. So that's really what it's about.
Okay, can I add just one thing and then I give the microphone? I was just wondering, because you mentioned at the end something very important, that is a transfer of technology. And this is something very, that we know in Asia, it's a very crucial topic, and it's part of the economic model in a way. And I wonder, what if we reverse clearly the process, considering that many things are done in Africa with this idea of open, adapted, banded technology? What if we ask them to come and to do in Western countries and in industrial countries to do this transfer of technology, of open technologies? That would be, I think that might be interesting. Just not to patronize on what they're doing, trying to do in very difficult conditions in their place.
Well, what I think I mentioned it at the beginning, that I guess it was in the context of the Arctic stuff. I mean, it's for us also a learning process. We understand culturally technologies differently. This kind of south to north flow of knowledge and experience does happen. It's still maybe a limited thing, but like Ushahidi, like Ubuntu, the leading open source projects are also, or some of them anyways, are coming from Africa. And I think, or the argument has been made by people like Dorothy Gordon and Philip Tigo and Makaigwa and others, that it does also have to do with certain forms of cultural collaboration which are rooted in, let's say, African society. So if maybe there's a different understanding about the way knowledge collaboration, knowledge sharing goes. We talk about shareism a lot when we were in Juba. People get it in a different way than if we start talking about it in very kind of abstract, technological, open source ways. So I think, yes, there is a lot to learn, and there's an event called Republika in Berlin, which started off as sort of like a German bloggers conference, but has kind of expanded to being quite a large event dealing with technology and innovation. This year, there's going to be about 13 of these innovation lab people, or people from 13 innovation labs in Africa coming to Berlin, to Republika. And each one of these labs has its own very special way of working and context and stuff. So the way that these folks at HONF are dealing with the issue of production of alcohol and so on. I mean, these are, I think for us also really interesting cultural technologies and about way of problem solving, which have nothing to do with kind of us going there and saying, okay, this is how you ferment, fruit. And, they're doing it. So for sure, there's a lot to learn, and there should be more of this kind of exchange going on. My beef is a lot with the usual international development system. So I worked in Ethiopia for a couple of years, around 10 years ago, and this idea of knowledge transfer is not a business model that most of the aid agencies and development organizations really want. Because if they achieve knowledge transfer, they're out of work. And that's,
Yeah, I was not talking about business, but more about the symbol to consider that we have things to learn from the South.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's linked, you know. So.
Hi, it's just a question around elites and people that have power. And I was wondering if in the June conference and the December conference, there was much discussion around elites, you know, have a vested interest in figuring out the means of production and then hanging on to it and making money out of that and profiting from that. So all of this is wonderful to hear the plan to provide open source and to kind of democratize and make technology available down at the grassroots level and build up a sense of identity and a sense of nation and a sense of state from the ground up. But, you know, history tells us that it doesn't usually work that way. Yeah. So particularly I was thinking about telecommunications companies and, you know, who owns the mobile phone industry in South Sudan, and are there discussions with them ongoing, and that kind of issue?
Yeah, of course it is an issue, but it's an issue on a number of different levels. So there's the side of it where people say, well, what are you doing talking about open source and technology when there's people starving? I was like, okay, well, we're talking about open source and open technology because people are starving. So that's kind of an easy one to deal with. The other one is about, well, who benefits then first from these kinds of things? And it could be that the so-called elite or the diaspora who are returning might get the quicker benefits of it, but without them implementing, developing these kinds of things also won't work. I mean, most of these politicians, like the governor of our upstate or the ambassador in Berlin, they're also from the diaspora. They almost all have a second passport. The ambassador lived for a long time in Canada. The governor in Kenya. I mean, through all these wars, you know, they were all over the place. It's hard actually to find people in the government who really, really were in South Sudan the whole time. And this is an issue in what you're talking about. And there's two lines that sort of like create sort of borders. There's two groups of people, those who are in the bush and are politicians and working in the country. Today there's the side of them that really wants to see this new tomorrow happen in South Sudan. But they have very, very little experience with anything other than fighting. And then there's the other ones who they just want to keep on fighting. That's the language they know. Then there's the diaspora, and they're also split kind of in between those. There's the sort of the opportunists who see a quick business thing happening, and then there's the visionaries who really want to see this new state succeed. So we're always kind of like wiggling around in between these people, and right now we're working a lot on kind of identifying who's kind of on our side, who are these visionaries also within the fighters on the ground in South Sudan. Fortunately, the telecom structure is relatively liberal, it's relatively cheap, and it's relatively open in South Sudan. There's at least 4 major companies and networks that have quite large penetration around the whole country, and it's increasing. This is also why most people have 2 or 3 phones, because they've got one sort of for each network. And one of the things which is really crazy is that you can pay for a week of phoning on one of these networks for less than the cost of buying a liter of milk. So that's also something which kind of shocked me as an outsider coming in there, that actually financially getting access to, you know, simple mobile technology is fairly straightforward. And that's why you've got this situation, which is also an incredible opportunity, where subsistence farmers out in the middle of kind of nowhere, cattle herders, you know, they have no clothes, but they've got a couple of phones. We haven't, as a project group, we haven't started yet discussing specifically directly with the telecoms companies, but some of our partners in South Sudan from this open source idea have connections to them. We've started through them because we have partners who are in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, also in the Telecommunications Ministry, who are open source advocates themselves. Again, they're guys who are coming from the States and from the UK and so on. Yeah, we try to avoid, let's say, the discussion about the elites, let's say, as being the people who are, let's say, surfing through the changes, because that's also, again, another